All right, while we're getting folks from the waiting room into the meeting, I'll go ahead and extend a welcome on behalf of our full University of Kentucky Shore Resource Center team. We're excited to have you in today's session to learn about some of the popular NIH R-Series funding mechanisms. If you're joining us for the first time, we're happy to receive your questions. Please populate those into the Q&A box at any time, but know that we will hold those until the formal presentation concludes. I'll share those out and give our presenter a chance to address them. We will wrap up around 4 o'clock today, so if you have follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to our center team, and we'll be happy to provide support. Additionally, we are recording today's session. Please give us 2 or 3 business days to get that recording processed and uploaded to our YouTube channel. You will receive an email when that recording is ready for you. So with that, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our speaker today. We have the Shore Resource Center Co-Program Director, Dr. Brett Spear, who's also a faculty member in the UK College of Medicine's Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics with us today. So welcome, Brett.
Thanks, Melissa. And welcome to everyone. Thanks for spending part of your day with us today. And as Melissa said, we're going to focus on one or several types of NIH grants, research grants, the R01, R03, and R21. And let me get share my screen here. Okay, that should be looking good now, I hope.
Looks good.
Okay. So what I'm going to do today is to give a brief overview of these 3 funding mechanisms. Now, there's a lot that could be said about these type of funding mechanisms, and there's no way we can cover everything in an hour. And I'm feeling that maybe you might have some questions too. So I'm going to try to make sure that there's enough time for the Q&A so that if there's any specific questions that you have, we can answer them. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've been here at University of Kentucky for 35 years now. And my research is in the area of liver disease, and I've had NIH funding since 1991, actually, for my research on liver disease. And I've served on a number of study sections, and recently just cycled off of a study section that I was the chair of the study section. So some of the comments that I have today are sort of reflective of my experiences, both as a grant writer as well as a reviewer. So just to give you an idea of what I hope to accomplish this afternoon here, first I want to just go over some definitions. NIH uses a lot of acronyms, and sometimes it gets a little complicated, but for the purposes of today's talk, I want to define some of the terms that I'll be using. I want to talk a little bit about program announcements and requests for applications, what are called PAs and RFAs. Talk a little bit about some of the tools that you can use to find the appropriate mechanism for you. There's many different institutes at NIH that fund different areas of research, and there's different funding mechanisms. And for your particular research, you might find that an R01 is most appropriate, or maybe the R21 is most appropriate. So talk a little bit about ways that you can maybe identify what's best for you. I want to talk a little bit about success rates. NIH makes this information available, and sometimes it's really useful to know what the success rates are for different types of grants and different institutes, so that you can target your grant to the best place to give you the greatest likelihood of funding. And then I'm going to go over these 3 grant or funding mechanisms in a little bit more detail. I'll first start with the R01, which is considered the gold standard of NIH funding. Then I'll talk a little bit about the R21s, which are more of an exploratory, high risk, high reward type funding mechanism. And finally, the R03, which are small research grants. And I'm going to shift a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about using data, because I think the data that you put into your grants is such an important part of the review process, and it's important to use and present that data effectively. And then I'll come around and just do a little comparison of these 3 funding mechanisms to sort of bring it full circle for this comparison. So I've got a lot of words here, but really just to go over this a little bit, there's certain terms that NIH uses regarding the types of grant opportunities and funding mechanisms. And one of the terms you'll hear used a lot is a NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity. So this is a formal announcement that comes out from NIH, and the term NOFO is used by many federal agencies, but it's a term that's used for a variety of different financial assistance programs, such as NIH grants. Those of you who've been doing this for a while may remember the term FOA, or a funding opportunity announcement, and basically the NOFO replaces FOA, but you can still hear both terms being used. Now, program announcements are formal statements about whether it's a new or perhaps an ongoing activity or program funding mechanism. And it basically serves as a reminder of continued interest if they want to just remind people about existing programs. Perhaps there's a modification of an existing program that they want people to know about. And finally, they might talk about something that's new. And program announcements come in different flavors. One of them is called a parent announcement. So these are opportunities, and all of the institutes and centers at NIH participate in the program. So the parent announcements are basically for unsolicited applications, or what are also known as investigator-initiated grant applications. So if you have an idea for a grant and you want to submit a proposal, you can submit that in response to what's called a program announcement. And we'll go into these in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but all of these different announcements have a specific activity code. So if you see an announcement that says PA, say -20-185, this is considered a parent announcement. And then they come in a couple of different varieties as well. You can have what's called a PAR, and this is a program announcement that may have either a special receipt date, they may have some additional considerations, there may be differences in budget issues, but there's some variation on that type of announcement that's a little different than sort of the standard parent announcement. And again, if you see something that's like a PAR, then this is this type of program announcement. And then finally, a PAS, or a program announcement with set-aside funds, again, is a program announcement. Again, it might have some specific instructions or specific requirements, but one of the things with the PAS is that NIH or the Institute has actually set aside specific funds for that particular funding mechanism. And then finally, something that's a little bit different is called a request for applications, or an RFA. So this is a formal announcement from NIH that either solicits a grant or something that's called a cooperative agreement in a very specific scientific area. And the goal here is to accomplish a very specific or specific objective. So an RFA, when an RFA comes out, it will normally tell you how many funds or how much funding is set aside for that program, as well as how many grants they anticipate funding in that program. So for example, an RFA might come out and say that the Institute is committing $6 million to this RFA, and they anticipate that they're going to fund 5 to 6 grants. So you get an idea here of really what the likelihood of funding might be based on how many grants they're going to be anticipate funding. So sometimes this information can be really helpful in determining whether you want to proceed in submitting a grant for that particular RFA. And then finally, notice of special interest, or NOSI, is something that just notifications that come out from NIH, just again to remind people about opportunities, and just give people updates about different funding mechanisms as well. So, it's really useful to sort of keep track of these different things. For example, let's say that a program announcement comes out in a particular area of research or a particular disease that the NIH wants to have investigated more, and your research is aligned with that particular announcement. If NIH has specific funds that are set aside for that particular area, then perhaps the likelihood of funding may be higher than just sort of a standard grant. So it's useful to become familiar with these different opportunities and be updated with them as well. So what I have here, as I've shown, is one way to sort of look at some of the different opportunities that are out there. And this is, if you just Google NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts, you'll come with this. But this is a really quick way, and this is updated on a regular basis every week, basically, to tell you about the program announcements and RFAs that are available. Now, with this, I just did a simple search just to use as an example here, and the keyword I used was liver, which is my area, as I said earlier. So this is area of research is near and dear to my heart. But you can do a more advanced search where you can look into some more details. But in terms of liver, at the current time, there's basically 11 different specific PARs, program announcements, or no size or notices. Or down here, we have an RFA as well, all that have some aspect of the funding opportunity relates to the liver. So you can use this to go in and sort of see what are some of the different opportunities that we have here. And they come from different institutes, and you have this information. So they'll actually say the notification or the notice number itself. So you can click on that and you can look in some more details about that particular opportunity. You can see which institute is issuing the notice, as well as potentially other organizations or other institutes or centers that may also participate in that as well. And it gives you some more information here, tells you, what type of funding mechanism this is. Is it an R01? Is it an R21? So on and so forth. So it can be really helpful for you to, again, identify areas of interest at NIH that may be aligned with your particular research here. And again, by clicking on to these, you can find information. And one of the important things when you look into these different announcements is that if you scroll to the bottom of the announcement, and these announcements can get pretty long, but if you scroll to the bottom of the announcement, it'll actually give you contact information at NIH. These would be program officers that you can contact if you want to get more information about the particular announcement. If you want to tell the program officer a little bit about your research, and they can tell you whether or not they feel like your research is aligned well with that particular announcement. So really useful information to have. Like I said, it's updated all the time. And you can actually get weekly updates if you want to. NIH does a great job of making the information available to investigators. So I really encourage you to look at this information and see if there's something, some opportunity out there that's really well aligned with your particular research. So next thing I want to just touch upon is the issue about success rates and how these are determined. And the first thing I'll say is that success rates vary. They're determined by the institute as well as the type of funding mechanism itself. Now there's, I believe, 24 institutes at NIH that actually fund extramural grants. I've just listed 3 of them here. And what I've done here is and this is for fiscal year 2023. So I've listed the number of R01 grant applications that were received, the number that were awarded, as well as the success rate. And I have this for R01s, R21s, as well as R03s. And I have them for 3 different institutes: National Cancer Institutes, Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So again, just 3 different institutes, just to give you an example of some of the information that's out there. So you can see with NCI, NCI actually awards, has the greatest budget of all the different institutes at NIH. So in that year, they received a little over 5,000 R01s, and of those, 793 were awarded, which gives us a success rate of about 14.6. And then you can see this numbers for the other institutes as well. So fewer applications for NIAID and even more for NIDA. But you can see the success rates in these different institutes for the R01s vary. In general, fewer grants are received for the R21s and the R03s, but again, it differs from institute to institute. And you can see here for the success rates for the R21 that for NCI, the success rate's 12%, a little over 21% for NIAID, and a little over 15% for NIDA. Okay, and so on and so forth. You can see the numbers over here for the R03s as well. So this is, can be very helpful information. Basically what this says is that, as I said, for R01s, almost 15% of the R01s are going to be funded, and NIH will have these numbers. So when you submit a grant, what you're going to get if the grant either may not get discussed in a study section, and if that's the case, then it won't be discussed, and that grant will not be funded. And normally, when grants come in, about 50% of the grants that come in that are going to be assigned to a particular study section, about 50% of the grants do not get discussed, and then about 50% of the grants do get discussed. And of those grants that did get discussed, you'll be getting an overall impact score, and then based on that impact score relative to the other impact scores that have been reviewed, you're going to get a percentile. So, for example, if the pay line for NCI is 14.6% for R01s, let's say you submit a grant, it gets reviewed, and you get a 10th percentile, then you're within the pay line, and it's a very, very high likelihood that your grant's going to get funded. Whereas if you submit a grant and even if it gets discussed, but you have a percentile, say, of 20 or 25%, that's going to be below the pay line and unlikely for funding. So knowing these pay lines, if they're available, can really be helpful. Now, these are not written in stone. For example, with NCI with a 14.6, if you get a 14 or a 13th percentile, chances are highly likely that you'll get funded. But there's also some wiggle room. If a grant comes in and let's say it comes in at, say, the 16th percentile, but it's in an area that NIH really wants to have some research, or NCI really is interested in that area of research, then they might fund it. So there's, like I said, it's not a well-defined line, but this information can really be useful. And then the other reason it's useful is that you can see the pay lines vary quite a bit between different agencies. So the success rate of R01s from NCI versus NIDA, that's quite a big difference here, 14.6 versus 20.7. So let's say now NCI and NIDA are pretty different types of research, but just using my own research, for example, I study liver disease and including liver cancer. And so a lot of my grants might be appropriate for NCI, but they're also appropriate for NIDDK, diabetes, digestion, and kidney diseases. They do a lot of liver grants as well. Now, the pay line for NIDDK is up around 20% for R01s. So, you might, if you were in my shoes, you might try to tailor your grant so it would be considered for funding by NIDDK rather than NCI, because the pay line is quite a bit different. So this is the type of information that you can use. Now, I will say that not all institutes and/or funding mechanisms use pay lines. Again, the pay line is the percent success rate here. So you may submit a grant and you may get an overall impact score, but you don't actually get a percentile. And in those situations, you really don't, it's not as clear for you to determine, the likelihood of success. But normally after a grant is submitted and you get your summary statement back, you can talk with your program officers and get some insight, a little at least, about the possibility of funding. The program officers are not going to tell you whether the grant is funded or not, but at least you can get some information to determine whether or not you should think about whether you want to resubmit your grant or not. Okay, so again, a lot of good information here, and it's all available from NIH. Okay, so with that background information, let's go in and let's talk a little bit about these different funding mechanisms. So the R01, it's a grant awarded in a very defined, specific area to be performed by the investigators, which is in an area that's reflective of the investigator's interest as well as their abilities. Okay, so if you have a particular interest in an area, if you have the reagents, the expertise, the equipment, the resources to carry out that particular research, then you can submit an R01 grant in that area. The R01s, as I mentioned earlier, is the sort of the gold standard of NIH funding. It's the most common RPG, or what's called a research project grant, and it's also historically it's the oldest extramural funding mechanism that NIH has. And a very large percentage of the RPGs that are submitted to NIH and are funded are the R01 mechanism. Now, all of the institutes and centers at NIH participate in the R01 program. R01 grants are renewable. Okay, so they have the potential for long-term funding. So if you are successful in getting an R01 grant, you have the funding for a particular period of time. You've been productive. You've published with what you've your findings, and things have gone really well. And it's clear that these are the next experiments that you want to do based on what you've accomplished during that period. Then you can go in for renewals. Okay, so you can have long-term funding through the R01 mechanism. Now, there's three types of R01 grants, and I should point out this. I'm talking about the parent applications here, with some of the PAS and PARs and the RFAs that may fall into the R01 category. Some of the things are a little bit different. But for the parent grant, there's sort of three types of R01 grants. You can have one where the clinical trial is not allowed. You can have one where the basic studies, you must have some human aspect to your work. It's not necessarily a clinical trial, but it does have some human subjects research that's involved with it. And then the third one is a clinical trial is required. And the announcements for these three types of R01 grants are different. But in the case of the R01s, you can request up to $500,000 in direct costs per year for up to 5 years. Okay, so that's a substantial amount of money. Now, if you are requesting up to $250,000, you can use a modular budget. So the budgeting for the grant, as well as doing the budget justification, tends to be a little more straightforward if you're using a modular budget. But if you're requesting over $250,000 and less than $500,000, then you have to do a more extensive budget justification with the application. Now, you can actually request for greater than $500,000 with the R01 grant. But in these cases, you have to contact the program officer ahead of time and get prior approval for any requests that you have for over $500,000. Preliminary data, whether it's figures or tables, are required for the R01 grants, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And then the research strategy for R01 grants is 12 pages. It's 1 page specific aims, and then the research strategy is 12 pages. And I just want to note that I know we think a lot about the amount of money we need to do our research, what is required to carry out whatever experiments we're going to do, what about personnel costs and everything. I think it's really important when you planning out your grant application and thinking about the budget. It's really important to budget whatever you need, whatever you feel you need in order to carry out that research. I know sometimes we think that, if we ask for a little bit less money, maybe the likelihood that we'll get funded is greater. And so we want to keep things, as low as we can. But with NIH funding, I don't think that's advisable. Okay. If, for example, you propose a series of experiments and you need a certain number of people to carry out those experiments, and it's going to be $300,000 to really do the work and to do it well, and you go in and you request, say, $200,000 because you want to, increase your likelihood of funding because you think they might fund it with less, if you're asking for less, you get the grant, then you're not going to be able to carry out the research that you want to do. So NIH's goal is to fund the best research that's out there. So when you're thinking about your budget, determine how much money you need, be realistic, don't be greedy, but don't try to undercut as well. Request the amount of funding that you think is necessary and justify it when you're putting your grant together. Okay, and again, with R01 grants, there's a lot of flexibility of what you can have because the budgets can get quite large. The other thing to keep in mind too, that a lot of times NIH, even if they fund a grant, the chances are that they could cut the budget. So keep that in mind. Again, that's why I think it's really important to request the funding that you need for the period of time that you need as well. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what's called early stage investigators or new investigators, which is a benefit that grant applicants can have when they're submitting their grant. So this ESI or NI or new investigator benefit is only available for grants such as R01s. It's not only R01s, but what are called R01 or R01 equivalent grants. And these are some of the other grants that are similar to the R01s. And we won't have time to go into all of these today. But if you're submitting an R01 or any of the other R01 equivalent grants, you may qualify for ESI or new investigator status. And this is something that can be really beneficial if you are an ESI or a new I. So how do you determine your status for ESI or new investigator? Well, first of all, you have to have an ERA Commons account, and you must input the information on that Commons account about, correct information about when you received your terminal degree or if you had clinical training, basically when your training period ended and when you began as an investigator, okay? Now, an early stage investigator is defined as a person who has not yet received a major NIH grant, such as an R01 or equivalent, as a PI. So you're still an ESI eligible if you've been co-investigator on a grant. You're still ESI eligible if you've had a smaller grant like an R21 or an R03. But if you have not received an R01 or equivalent as a PI, and it's been less than 10 years since you've received your terminal degree or completed your clinical training, then you qualify for ESI status. Okay. Now, in terms of this 10-year period, you should also note that you can request that your ESI status be extended for reasons that might have slowed down your progress or caused gaps in your time as, say, a faculty member. These might be medical concerns, it might be disability, family care responsibilities, so on and so forth. But because of these other responsibilities that have taken you away from your ability to do research, you can request that your ESI status can be extended. And then NIH, when you make a request, NIH will decide whether or not they'll approve that. So I think that's something that's really important. And then a new investigator is a person, regardless of how far it's been since they've received their terminal degree or completed their training, this is a person that has never received an R01 grant or an equivalent as a PI. And again, if you've co-investigator or a consultant on another person's grant, that does not disqualify you. So why is ESI or new investigator status important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. And one reason is that a lot of the institutes have different pay lines for ESI or new investigators. Okay, so for example, the pay line might be, say, 20 percentile for established investigators, and they may be bumped up to, say, 25th percentile for ESIs or new investigators. And NIH is doing this because they really want to make sure that the pipeline of young investigators that are involved with NIH research continues. And so it's really, from their perspective, it's really important that established investigators as well as new investigators are participating in biomedical research in this country. So, and again, that prioritized funding varies from institute to institute. Okay, so there's not one size fits all. But the other thing is that the applications for ESI and new investigators are reviewed separately. So for example, in the study section that I just rotated off of, when we had our series of grants that we were going to review in our study section, and we normally reviewed 40 to 45 grants in our study section, the first block of grants that we reviewed were the R01 grants from established investigators. And usually that was about, I'd say maybe 70 to 75%, maybe 70% of the grants. It varied from time to time, but about 70% of the grants were from established investigators, and they were all reviewed together so that established investigators were sort of, compared to each other. And then after we got through with all the established investigators, we reviewed the the R01 grants from the ESI or new investigators. And we were told before the grant process began that, our expectations should be a little bit different for the ESI or the new investigators. We shouldn't necessarily expect them to have a real robust publication record because they haven't been, doing this for as long as an established investigator. Maybe they might not have as much preliminary data as an established investigator. So the ESI or new investigators was compared more to each other than to the real established investigators. And again, I think that provided a little bit of an advantage to the newer investigators as well. So I think that if you qualify for ESI or new investigator status, you might want to consider submitting an R01 grant because that added benefit that you might get. I will say then after the new investigators, then at least in my study section, we reviewed the R21s and the R03s at the end. So anyway, just wanted to touch base about that if that's relevant to anyone that's listening. Okay, so moving on to the R21 grants. So these are considered to be exploratory or developmental research projects, okay? They're considered to be high risk, high reward, with the potential to have a major impact on a particular field, whether it's biomedical, behavioral, or clinical, okay? Now, not all institutes or centers participate with all of the parent announcements, okay? So you really have to check to make sure that your participating organization is participating in a particular funding opportunity. I mentioned earlier that I do liver research. A lot of my grants go to NIDDK, but NIDDK does not participate in the R21 parent announcements. They might have some special announcements or RFAs for R21s, but for the parent announcements, NIDDK does not participate. Okay, so you want to check this. If you're interested in R21, you may want to check whether an institute you're looking at participates in that or not. Once again, with the R21 grants, you can have situations where the clinical trial is not allowed, where the clinical trial is allowed or is required, or that you can have some human subjects as well. And the parent announcements for these three are different than each other. Now, with the R21 grants, you can request up to $275,000 over a 2-year period. Preliminary data is not required, but is highly recommended. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And in this case, you have a 1-page Ames page and then a 6-page research strategy. And I really want to emphasize that sometimes people think of an R21 as sort of a small R01 grant. And that's not the purpose of the R21. The R21 is really a high risk, high reward exploratory grant. So, maybe you have a really interesting idea, maybe it won't play out, but if it really did, it could have a really high impact. So it's important that you understand or appreciate, how reviewers look at the R21 grants. And I will say again, getting back to my study section, we'd see R01 grant or R21 grants, and a number of them would be, this just sort of looks like a small R01 grant. And in those situations, it was uncommon for those grants to really get, strong reviews. But then some would come along and it's like, wow, this is a really neat idea. It's risky, it might not work, but if it did work, it would really have an impact. So those are the kind of, ideas you want to try to target towards an R21 mechanism. And then finally, the R03 grants. Again, these are small grants. They provide research support for a limited time and for pretty much a small sort of type of a research study, very, very well-defined, very specific research study that's going to really be short-term, so that whatever you're proposing to do could be accomplished in 1 to 2 years. Now the R21s, I don't think I mentioned it, but the R21s and the R03 grants are not renewable. So there's a one-shot deal, okay? Now, if those grants do well, then maybe you get a lot of good data, then maybe you could then develop those into an R01 grant. But as they are, they're not renewable. R03s, you can request up to $50,000 a year in direct cost for up to 2 years. Clinical trials are not allowed with the R03 grants. Really a mechanism to generate a little bit of data, maybe some pilot data that you could develop into a bigger grant. Once again, preliminary data is not required, but highly recommended. And with the R21 grant, the R03 grants also have a 6-page research strategy that goes along with the 1-page specific aims. So that's just a brief overview of the 3 different types of grants. I wanted to just give you a couple of examples of these different types of funding mechanisms with some actual grants. And these were just grants that I pulled off of the NIH Reporter, which gives information of all the funded grants that they have. And the first example is an R01 from Brian Fink. Actually, I know Brian. He's an excellent scientist who's at Washington University in St. Louis. This is the grant number here. And this grant has been going on for a while. This is actually, he's gotten this grant renewed several times. He's in his 9th year now. The direct costs for year 9 are a little over $261,000. And don't want to go into great detail here, but he's really interested in developing drugs that can treat either insulin resistance or a growing problem in the United States that's associated with obesity called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Again, this is quite common and it's growing. And he wants to use mouse models to characterize some of these new drugs that he and his collaborators have sort of screened over the last a couple of years. And so he has 3 aims that are listed in this grant. He's going to test a hypothesis that these inhibitors of mitochondrial function will improve insulin sensitivity and reduce the severity of disease in NASH. And then he's really going to dig into molecular mechanisms, how these different drugs are really affecting mitochondrial function in these different endpoints. And then he's going to look specifically at a particular cell type in the liver called the stellate cell that's important in liver fibrosis. So a very, thorough, in-depth grant, very mechanistic grant, a lot of studies that are going to be going on here. So really nice example, I think, of an R01 type of grant that's has a lot of research being proposed over a long period of time. And then the next one I have is an example of R21, a human liver on chip model for studying alcohol-associated liver disease, or ALD. The PI here is Ekihiro Seki. Eki Seki was he was on the study section I was on. He's out in LA at Cedars-Sinai. This grant was funded by Allergy or Alcohol NIAAA. This grant's funded for $262,500 over the 2-year period. Alcohol-associated liver disease is a huge problem in this country, and really the only way to really monitor this disease is through biopsies. There's some other ways, but those ways aren't really great. So there's a real need to come up with in vitro models to sort of understand this disease and to monitor disease. And so I think one of the reasons this has done well for an R21 is that he's developed this liver on a chip model. So combining some real impressive engineering along with some expertise in the liver field to come up with this in vitro system to study some of the cells that are associated with liver disease. And so these in vitro models are really needed to really help understand disease mechanisms. And so again, to me, it's a perfect example of sort of a high risk, high reward type of R21 mechanism. It could be that this in vitro liver on a chip doesn't work really well, but if it does work well, then this type of in vitro model is really going to be useful to sort of help tease out some of the different processes that are going on with liver disease, alcohol-associated liver disease. And finally, this is an example of a R03 grant from Sanjeev Harbavat from Baylor College of Medicine. Again, it's a 2-year grant, $75,000 over that time. A new method for bilirubin screening for biliary atresia. So biliary atresia is a significant problem in this country where the bile ducts do not function properly, and then you get accumulation of toxic products in the liver and then in the body that can be life-threatening. It's not that uncommon. It's a leading indication for pediatric liver transplants. So this is a real big problem. And there's ways to diagnose it, but a lot of the problems with the current strategies is that they're a little bit late. And if a a child is born with this condition here, the sooner you can identify it and try to resolve it mainly through surgery, the better the outcome. And so they're coming up with a novel method that they propose is going to be more effective than current methods to identify those children that may have biliary atresia. And they're going to be comparing it to existing programs, and then they're going to use the dried blood spot cards that blood is collected from newborn infants, and use that to sort of analyze their method to see if the method they want to use is going to be better than existing methods and can be used at infants that are younger age. So again, a real, very well-defined, sort of innovative, but a well-defined study that doesn't take a lot of effort, doesn't take a lot of money, but could really have a big impact. So just a couple of examples of the different mechanisms that are out there. We'll take a minute and talk about data. I mentioned that R01 grants require data, whereas some of the other R21s and R03 grants do not. But I will say, first of all, scientists like to see data, so you really want to have good data in your grant. Preliminary data is expected for R01 grants, and you know, you want to have a good amount of data here to support whatever you propose doing. I'd say 9 to 12 figures is not unusual. And even though preliminary data is not required for R21 and R03s, I would highly recommend including that data. I don't know if I've ever reviewed an R21 or an R03 grant without some data, even if it's just a small amount. Data can be used in several ways. First of all, it can support your hypothesis or support what you propose doing, and this is really important, but sometimes just demonstrating feasibility can be really helpful. So if you're using a novel technique or something that is not really used a lot, you know, to show some data proving that you can do this can really be helpful and can impact the enthusiasm of your reviewers. But keep in mind, any data that you include in a grant can be evaluated. Okay, so make sure your data is good. Okay, that's really important. Any of the images should be clear. The words should be readable on a printed page, you know, so you don't have to keep, you know, blow things up so much. I've seen some grants where I can't even read the words on that grant application. Now, published data can be included, okay? And I would recommend, even though you've published the data, if the data is really important for that grant, I would also put it into your grant as well, okay? Now, reviewers are not required to read anything that is not in the application itself. So the data is really important, put it in there. Now, I think reviewers, myself included, normally will look at published papers from whoever submitted the grant, but it's not a guarantee. So I like to put a little bit of published data as well as unpublished data when I'm putting my grant applications together. Okay, so to come back around, just to compare the R01s, R21s, and R03s, just to, as we talked about, an R01 is a mature project supported by all institutes. R21s are exploratory or developmental, and the R03s are small research projects. And even though data is not required for the R21s and R03s, I highly recommend it. A little difference in the scope, how much you have to put in. Again, the R01s are renewable, so you can have long-term project, 2 years for the R21 and the R03s. And again, these are for the parent announcements. For some of the special announcements, they can vary. We've talked a little bit about the amount of funding that's allowable. But I just want to emphasize too that, again, R01s can provide substantial funding for longer periods of time. And with the R01s, you do get new investigator ESI status. R21s, again, they're smaller. They shouldn't be considered a small R01. They're high risk, high reward. These really are recommended more for established investigators that are looking to, maybe they want to start something new, or they got some data that they want to explore a little bit more. So this is really targeted towards established investigators rather than new investigators. And if you look at the numbers, the success rate for established investigators for R21 is much, much higher for success rate for R21s for new investigators. And once again, the R03s, these are small grants for a small period of time. So they're not recommended for new investigators, but feasibility studies for some of the labs that are more well established. And part of the reason why I think a couple of other reasons why some of these R21s and R03s maybe are I would say should be new investigators may not want to consider these is because 2 years of funding is not that long. It's nice if you can get a grant for 4 or 5 years and then you can have those grants long enough that you can start generating some data to keep things going. But 2 years of funding, boy, that goes really fast if when you have those grants. So keep that in mind. So preliminary data or feasibility data is extremely helpful. But again, if you're going to present data, make sure it's really good data. Don't assume that grants are more likely to be funded simply because you're requesting less money. And then NIAID, if you just go, if you Google sample grants, NIAID, they have a number of sample grant applications. So if you want to look at existing R01s, R21s, or R03 grants, you can look at this site and get an idea of some of the grants that have been funded, at least through this institute. And finally, which grants might be best for me? I think you sort of have to look at some of these different considerations and maybe think about what one might be best. So if you have a lot of strong preliminary data, if there's strong rationale for your study, then I would say the R01 mechanism might be one you want to think about. Could the project develop long-term? I think in all cases, in R21 or an R03, if you get some good data from these smaller grants, then they can transition to a R01 or another long-term funding mechanism. So in all cases, all of these have the potential for long-term funding. Do I have a real strong publication record? Do I have a track record in my field? If you do, you might be competitive for R01 funding. Obviously, regardless of the funding mechanism, you have to show that you have the expertise and the resources to carry out whatever studies you're proposing. If you don't have the expertise or resources yourself, co-investigators are always can be valuable. Is your project high risk reward, highly innovative? If that's the case, you want to look at the R21s. Are you looking at just a small project, something where you might be able to generate some preliminary data for a larger project? Maybe you want to generate some pilot data, some feasibility data. You might want to consider R03s. If the project can be achieved in 1 or 2 years, then R21 or R03. If it's going to take more time, then R01 might be what you want. And then how much funding do you need to carry out the goals? Because funding for the R21s and R03s are limited. And then if you're a new investigator or early stage, then you might want to consider the benefits you get through an R01 grant, because these benefits are not available through R21s or the R03s. And then finally, what about if you're at an institution that has limited resources or say a high teaching load, okay? In these situations, something like an R16 or R15 grant might be something you want to look at. And I know we haven't talked about that here today. We've had other webinars about these funding mechanisms, but I think the expectations, the requirements for the R16s and the R15s are a little bit different. So you might want to think about these. And I would argue maybe the R16s you really want to look at, because at least at this current time, the success rates of R16s are considerably higher than the R15 grants. But these grants are only for institutions that have a limited amount of NIH funding. So you're not really competing with the Harvards and Stanfords and MITs of the world, which you would be competing with some of these institutes with some of these other funding mechanisms. Okay, and finally, I want to emphasize once again, it's how important it is to talk to program officers when you're thinking about funding mechanisms, thinking about institutes, thinking about different announcements, what's best for you. Contact program officers. All the announcements at the end of the announcement list the program officers you can contact. By doing so, they can help you find the most appropriate funding opportunity for your research. If their institute is not the best one, they might recommend other institutes you want to consider. Keep in mind all the different institutes and centers at NIH, they have different missions and priorities, they have different budgets, they have different ways to decide how they're going to fund grants. So you really want to have that information to increase the likelihood that you're going to have success. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Brett. So I'm going to start with the Q&A box. If you joined us after my intro and have put questions in the chat, if you would kindly copy those over, it's just a little easier for me to have those all in the same place. And we'll take about 10 minutes of questions here. So the first one says, there was a plan to raise the R03 award value from $50K to $100K per year for 2 years. When can we expect to see that raise happen?
So I will comment on that since I brought this up earlier when Brett and I were talking about it. So it's not universal across all institutes yet. The parent R03 announcement still says 50,000 per year, but it expires in January. So some institutes have already instituted their own R03 programs with 100,000 per year. So the example that I'm most familiar with is NIA. NIA has now an R03 program where it's 100,000 per year for 2 years. So it's double the amount of money. But what I've seen so far with these is the NIA one, for example, is targeted. It's for people who are new to AD research. So if you were an established investigator like me, you couldn't apply for that.
Yeah, but you'll see it. It will be coming. So thanks for that question.
Okay, the next question is asking if you can clarify a little bit the difference between an RFA and a PAS.
Well, an RFA, one of the big differences is with an RFA, they'll be very, very specific about what they're looking for. They'll also tell you how much money has been set aside for that program, and they'll tell you how many grants they anticipate funding. So you get that information. With a PAS, there's set aside funds, but that you don't get as many details about what they really want. Now, if you talk to the program officer, you might get some more information, but in the announcement, it won't give you as many details.
Okay, next question. If a PAR does not list a specific institute or center as a participant, but the center is very relevant to the research, is it ever possible to have a project be funded, or is it pretty set in stone that that center does not participate?
It's probably highly unlikely that they'll participate. I think these things are pretty well worked out at NIH before an announcement is set out. So if an institute is not listed as a participant, it's highly unlikely that that's going to change.
Okay. The next question is asking if you can speak to the optimal % effort that a PI should devote to these various funding mechanisms.
I think you have to decide what you think is appropriate. Now you have to factor that with your budget as well. With an R01, you have a lot more flexibility about what you can have. I would say for a lot of R01s, what I see is normally anywhere from 15 to 25%. But I've seen some that are higher, and I've seen some that are going down to 10. But you really have to try to balance it best what you think you have to do. But I would say, 20 to 25% is, I think, is pretty much average.
I will say that some institutes do have some guidelines. So, and some programs. So I know that for, I think NINDS says for an R01, they have a PI has to have 20% minimum.
Yeah.
So you should also be aware if there are things like that.
Yeah. And I've also seen where new investigators will have more effort on a grant than maybe an established investigator too. So, yeah.
The next question would like you to clarify the difference between a grant review and a grant being discussed.
So any grant that goes into NIH and that is basically passes muster so that it's going to be sent out, those grants are going to be sent to a study section. 3 people on that study section will review the grant, and they will give what are called preliminary impact scores. And based on those scores, so everyone gets that review. The lower 50% of the grants will not be discussed. You'll know what the reviewers think, but you won't have that discussion. And then the top 50% of those grants will actually be discussed at that study section. So that's the distinction. So all grants get a review, but only roughly half of them actually will get discussed when the study section meets, whether it's Zoom or in person.
Okay. Next question says, my R21 resubmission to NCI was at 12% this year, and the PO informed me that they expect the pay line to be at 7%. Do you have any suggestions on how to help this R21 be funded? Should I contact the program officer again? In the original email response, she said she cannot help with increasing the chances of the application being funded.
That is correct. But you still can talk to the program officer and hopefully they will give you some insight about things you might want to consider. You want to, when you contact them, you want to, have some questions laid out. You just say, what can I do to get funded? But, what do you see might be ways I can strengthen my application? I will say that I've had some outstanding program officers that have been very helpful in helping me consider ways of trying to restructure my grant. And I've had some program officers that give very little insight. So it's a little bit hit or miss, but I think you really have to try to talk to them and see if you can get some advice.
The other thing I'll add there too is, so I've had an R21 in the past. I've had two different things happen to me this way. I've had one where it was outside the pay line by a fair bit. It was, I think originally it was 15th percentile, and they told me the pay line was going to be about 9. And they surprised me by funding it because I actually wasn't expecting it at all. And I probably should have talked to the program officer more about that because I got like the notification like a week before the federal fiscal year deadline. So you should watch for those sort of things. So if you talk to your program officer, one of the things you can get from them, if they like the project, when it gets to the end of the fiscal year, sometimes they might pick it up. So you should talk to them and see if they think it's a good project anyway, because there might be a chance that it could make it at the end of the year, in which case you should make sure you get your just-in-time information in.
Yep. Right.
Okay, we have several questions on a similar topic, so I'm just going to combine those. But there are folks that are asking how you see what sort of grants in your field have been funded, and how do you select a study section that might be a good fit?
So yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, if you know some other people that are in your field, whether they're at your institution or people at other institutions that are in your field, sometimes they can give you some insight. People on a study section can't talk about any of the grants that are reviewed in that study section. So you can't talk to people on a study section. You can talk to people after they come off, about maybe things, but the program officer is also that person that can really give you some insight about, what's what they're looking for, how you might want to target, that grant, things you might want to prioritize in the grant. So if you have colleagues and your program officer, I think are the best people to try to go to.
Okay, there are also a few questions about including collaborators, and specifically, can you have collaborators from outside of your institution?
Most definitely. Most definitely. So if you have collaborators, regardless of where they are, you can have them. And especially if there's expertise or some technology that you don't have at your institution, going outside your institution is perfectly acceptable. It's not a problem whatsoever.
Okay. This question asks if you can speak to the inclusion of qualitative data as preliminary data in a grant application.
I think preliminary data is okay, but you have to make sure you don't overstate it. If you're putting in, and I've done this, I'm sure Paul has too. I put in some data that's, it's pilot data, it's preliminary, it's not, significant. I wouldn't, so you want to state that I understand that this is preliminary data, but at least it shows that you've done some work and that, you can do whatever has to be done. But if you're putting in preliminary data, don't overstate its significance.
There are a lot of questions about ESI status, so I don't think we'll be able to address all of those, but I can include a link to NIH's information on ESI status and using ERA Commons to navigate that a bit when we send our follow-up email.
Great.
So we'll just finish up with one question. It says R03 and R21 mechanisms may not be recommended for new investigators, but are there any other small grants that might be a good fit?
Well, I'll say something really quick while Brett's pondering. R03s can be for new investigators because like the one I just mentioned with NIA is specifically targeted for people who are new to Alzheimer's research. And so as a pilot grant, that's very different from an R21, which is high risk, high reward. This is specifically a pilot grant for new people who are new to that field. So it is possible.
Yeah, so again, a lot of my comments were regarding the parent grant announcements, sort of those standard things. But for specific announcements, like Paul said, there might be a specific announcement for new investigators. NIDDK doesn't support R21s, but they do have an R21 program for new investigators. So there might be something out there. Again, institute variability, there might be something out there for new investigators, for investigators who are underrepresented. So you might want to look into those things. Yeah.
Well, we do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll wrap up with a Q&A here. I will just remind you that if you are at an R16 eligible institution, our team here at UK in the Sure Resource Center would love to connect with you and be happy to follow up with additional questions that you might have. So certainly feel free to email or call us as a follow-up. All right, thanks all.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.